The mare collapsed beneath her on the dusty trail between Sacramento and Petaluma, and Theresa Porter knew, with a sickening certainty, that she was going to die out here in the California wilderness. It was August 1878, and the merciless sun beat down on the parched landscape as her beloved horse, the only companion she had left in this world, went down on trembling forelegs before rolling onto her side with a sound that broke Theresa's heart. She managed to throw herself clear, landing hard on the packed earth, the impact jarring every bone in her 22-year-old body. Dust filled her mouth and nose as she scrambled to her knees, crawling back to the mare that had carried her faithfully for 3 days without proper rest or water. "No, no, please," Theresa whispered, her voice cracking as she stroked the horse's sweat-soaked neck. The animal's flanks heaved with labored breaths, foam flecking her muzzle. Theresa had pushed too hard, driven by desperation to reach Petaluma before her father's enemies caught up with her. Now she would pay the price for her foolishness. Stranded miles from anywhere with nothing but a canteen that held perhaps 2 more swallows of water, and the oppressive heat that shimmered off the golden hills in visible waves. She pressed her forehead against the mare's neck and felt hot tears track through the dust on her cheeks. Her father had been murdered 2 weeks ago in a land dispute gone violent, shot down in front of their modest ranch house outside Sacramento by men who wanted the water rights he refused to sell. Theresa had watched from the window, helpless and terrified, as the life drained from the only family she had left. The men had set fire to the house, and she had barely escaped with her life, grabbing what she could and fleeing on her father's mare while flames consumed everything she had ever known. The mare's breathing grew more labored, and Theresa knew the animal could go no further. She had ridden her too hard, stopped too infrequently, all because fear had driven her forward like a whip. Now she sat in the middle of nowhere, the August sun climbing toward noon, with a dying horse and no hope of survival. The trail to Petaluma stretched ahead, empty and unforgiving, and behind her lay only death and ashes. That was when she heard the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats. Theresa's head snapped up, her hand instinctively moving to the small pistol tucked into her belt. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she squinted into the glare, trying to make out whether salvation or doom approached. The rider materialized slowly from the heat shimmer, a tall figure on a sturdy bay gelding, and as he drew closer, she could make out the details. A broad-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun, a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and the easy posture of a man who had spent his entire life in the saddle. He reined in about 20 feet away, and Theresa got her first clear look at him. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. His eyes, a startling shade of gray-green, assessed the situation with the quick intelligence of someone accustomed to trouble. He sat perfectly still for a long moment, his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle, making no sudden moves that might spook her. "That horse is done," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that somehow carried clearly despite the distance between them. It was not unkind, merely stating an obvious fact. "I know," Theresa said, her throat tight. She kept her hand near her pistol, though she was not entirely sure she could use it even if she needed to. Her father had taught her to shoot, but shooting at targets was vastly different from shooting at a person. The man swung down from his saddle with fluid grace, and Theresa tensed. He noticed immediately and stopped, holding his hands slightly away from his body to show he meant no harm. "Name is Quinn Morrison," he said. "I am headed to Petaluma myself. You look like you could use some help." "I can manage," Theresa said automatically, though they both knew it was a lie. The mare's breathing had become a horrible, rattling sound, and Theresa felt each labored breath like a knife to her own chest. Quinn moved slowly toward the horse, his movements deliberate and calm. He knelt beside the mare and ran his hands over her legs, her flanks, examining her with the practiced touch of someone who knew horses inside and out. His expression grew grave as he worked, and when he finally looked up at Theresa, there was genuine sympathy in those unusual eyes. "She is beyond help," he said quietly. "I am sorry. The kindest thing would be to end her suffering." Theresa felt the words like a physical blow, even though she had known it was coming. "I know," she whispered. "I just do not know if I can do it." Quinn stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees. "I can do it for you if you want, quick and painless." She wanted to say yes, to let this stranger take the burden from her, but the mare had been her father's horse, the last living connection to the man who had raised her alone after her mother died in childbirth. To let someone else end that connection felt like a betrayal. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I will do it." She drew her pistol with shaking hands, and Quinn stepped back to give her space. Theresa knelt beside the mare again, stroking the velvet nose, whispering apologies and thanks and goodbye all tangled together. The mare's dark eyes, glazed with pain and exhaustion, seemed to look right through her. Theresa pressed the barrel against the horse's forehead, exactly where her father had taught her, closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked across the empty landscape, and the mare went still. Theresa sat back hard, the pistol falling from her nerveless fingers, and pressed both hands over her face as sobs tore through her chest. She had not cried like this even when her father died, shock and fear overriding grief. But now it all came pouring out in great, wrenching waves that left her gasping. She was dimly aware of Quinn moving around her, heard the soft sounds of him unpacking gear from her dead horse, but she could not stop crying long enough to care what he was doing. When she finally managed to get herself under control, her face was swollen and her throat raw, and Quinn was standing beside his bay gelding with her saddlebags, and bedroll arranged neatly on the ground. "We need to get moving," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "This sun will kill you just as sure as those men you are running from." Theresa's head jerked up. "How did you know?" Quinn nodded toward her mare. "Horse that worn down. You look like you have not slept in days, and you have got a pistol you barely know how to use but are willing to draw on a stranger. You are running from something. Given the direction you are headed and the way you keep looking back down the trail, I would guess it is men rather than the law." She should have been alarmed that he had read her so easily, but instead she felt a strange sense of relief. "My father was murdered. The men who did it burned our ranch. I am trying to reach Petaluma, where my father's sister lives. I have not seen her since I was a child, but I have nowhere else to go." Quinn absorbed this information with a slow nod, then made a decision that would change both their lives. He gathered up her belongings and secured them to his saddle, working with efficient, economical movements. When everything was fastened, he turned to Theresa and held out his hand to help her to her feet. "Horse can carry one of us, not both," he said. "Not in this heat, not for the distance we have got to cover. You will ride, I will walk." Theresa stared at him as if he had just offered to fly her to Petaluma. "That is insane. It must be 15 miles still, maybe more." "Closer to 18, I reckon," Quinn said calmly. "And yes, it will be a hard walk. But I am not the one who just lost everything and has been riding for 3 days straight with no sleep. You will ride, I will walk, and we will both get to Petaluma alive. Now come on, before this sun gets any higher." She wanted to argue, but the truth was that she could barely stand. Her legs shook beneath her, her head swam with dehydration and exhaustion, and the thought of walking 18 miles through this heat was impossible to contemplate. Still, the sheer generosity of his offer left her speechless. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Quinn's expression softened slightly, and for just a moment she saw past the weathered exterior to the man beneath. "Because somebody ought to," he said simply. "Now mount up before I change my mind." Theresa let him help her into the saddle, and the moment she settled onto the bay's broad back, relief flooded through her. The gelding was strong and solid beneath her, nothing like her exhausted mare, and she felt the first flicker of hope she had experienced in weeks. Quinn handed her his canteen, which was blessedly full, and she took a long drink before handing it back. "Keep it," he said. "Drink as much as you need. I know where the water is between here and Petaluma." He took the bay's reins and started walking, setting a steady pace that ate up the ground without pushing too hard. Theresa swayed in the saddle, fighting to stay upright, and Quinn glanced back at her with concern. "You can sleep if you need to," he said. "Brutus here has got a smooth gait, and I will make sure you do not fall." "Brutus." Despite everything, Theresa felt a small smile tug at her lips. "You named your horse Brutus." "He is a betrayer," Quinn said with a perfectly straight face. "Ran off with my neighbor's mare twice before I got him gelded. Figured the name fit." The unexpected humor caught Theresa off guard, and she found herself laughing, a short, startled sound that felt strange after so much grief and fear. Quinn glanced back at her again, and this time there was the hint of a smile around his eyes, though his mouth remained serious. They walked in silence for a while, the sun climbing higher and the heat becoming almost unbearable. True to his word, Quinn maintained a steady pace, never complaining or showing signs of difficulty, despite the fact that he was walking in boots that were meant for riding, not hiking through the California foothills. Theresa tried to stay awake, tried to maintain her vigilance, but exhaustion dragged at her like an anchor, and eventually her eyes drifted closed. She woke with a start some time later, momentarily disoriented, to find that the sun had moved considerably toward the western horizon, and they were descending into a small valley where a creek cut through the landscape. Quinn had one hand on her leg, steadying her, and she realized he must have been holding her in the saddle while she slept. "Easy," he said. "You have been out for about 3 hours. Figured you needed it. We will water the horse here and rest for a bit before we push on to Petaluma." Theresa slid from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling beneath her, and Quinn caught her elbow to steady her. His hand was warm and calloused, the grip sure and strong, and she felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She pushed the feeling away, attributing it to her vulnerable state, and focused instead on the creek. The water was cold and clear, obviously fed from somewhere higher in the mountains, and Theresa knelt beside it to splash her face and neck before drinking deeply. Quinn led Brutus downstream to drink, then hobbled him so he could graze on the sparse grass that grew along the creek bank. When he returned, he sat down on a large flat rock and pulled off his boots, dumping out what looked like a considerable amount of sand and small stones. "Your feet must be killing you," Theresa said, guilt washing over her. "They have been better," Quinn admitted, flexing his toes with a grimace. "But I have walked further in worse conditions. Do not worry yourself about it." "Why are you going to Petaluma?" Theresa asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from staring at the way the fading sunlight caught the planes of his face. "Looking for work," Quinn said, leaning back on his hands and tilting his face toward the sky. Been working ranches up north for the past few years, but the winter was hard and a lot of places are not hiring. Heard there might be opportunities around Petaluma, figured I would see for myself. What about your aunt? What does she do? She married a shopkeeper, last I heard, Theresa said. Her name is Margaret Hanson. I have not seen her since I was 7, but she and my father wrote occasionally. I found her last letter in my father's papers, which is the only reason I know where to go. I do not even know if she will remember me, or if she will want to take in a niece she has not seen in 15 years. Family is family, Quinn said with a certainty that suggested he knew something about the subject. She will remember you, and she will take you in. And if she does not, well, we will figure something else out. The casual way he said we sent another flutter through Theresa's chest, and this time she could not dismiss it quite so easily. She studied him more carefully, this stranger who had given up his horse and was walking 18 miles through brutal heat to help someone he had never met. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, with the kind of face that suggested he had lived a hard life, but had not let it make him hard. There was a quiet strength about him, a confidence that came from self-reliance rather than arrogance, and she found herself wanting to know more about him. "You have family?" she asked. Quinn's expression shuddered slightly, and she knew immediately that she had touched on something painful. "Had a brother," he said after a moment. "Lost him to cholera 6 years back. Parents died when I was young. It has just been me for a long time now." "I am sorry," Theresa said softly. "I know what it is like to lose the people you love." Their eyes met across the small space, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. They were both alone in the world, both survivors who had learned to keep moving forward no matter what life threw at them. In that moment, Theresa felt less isolated than she had in weeks, as if she had found an unexpected ally in this lonely landscape. Quinn broke the connection first, looking away to check the position of the sun. "We should get moving again. Want to make Petaluma before full dark if we can." Town is not always friendly to strangers after nightfall. They set off again, Quinn walking and Theresa riding, and as the miles passed beneath them, they talked. Not about anything particularly deep or meaningful, just the small exchanges that helped pass the time and build familiarity. Quinn told her about some of the ranches he had worked, the characters he had met, the horses he had trained. Theresa found herself telling him about her father, about growing up on a small ranch with just the two of them, about learning to rope and ride and shoot because her father had no sons to teach. "He sounds like he was a good man," Quinn said when she fell silent, her voice thick with renewed grief. "He was the best man I ever knew," Theresa said. "He could have sent me to live with relatives after my mother died, could have given me to someone who could raise me proper like a lady. But he kept me with him and taught me to be strong, taught me to survive. I wish I could have saved him the way he saved me so many times." "You could not have stopped what happened," Quinn said firmly. "Men who kill over land and water, they are not going to be deterred by anything you could have done. Your father would want you to live, not throw your life away trying to avenge him." "How do you know what my father would want?" Theresa asked, but there was no heat in her words, only exhaustion and sorrow. "Because I lost my brother trying to be a hero," Quinn said quietly. "Stepped between me and a man with a knife during a bar fight in Stockton. Took the blade meant for me. I wanted to go after the man who killed him, wanted to make him pay. But my brother's last words were to let it go, to live my life, to not let his death be the thing that defined me. It took me a long time to honor that, to understand that the best way to remember someone is not through vengeance but through living the kind of life they would be proud of." Theresa absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. She had not thought beyond reaching Petaluma, beyond finding safety. The idea of actually building a new life, of finding a way to be happy again, seemed almost impossible. But Quinn spoke with such conviction that she found herself wanting to believe him. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they crested a final hill and Petaluma spread out below them. It was not a large town, but after days in the wilderness, it looked like paradise to Theresa's exhausted eyes. Lights were beginning to appear in windows, and she could make out the shapes of buildings lining what appeared to be a main street. "We made it," Quinn said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. He turned to look up at her, and in the fading light, his eyes seemed more green than gray. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I have any right to be, thanks to you," Theresa said honestly. "I do not know how to repay you for what you have done." "No need for repayment," Quinn said, waving away her gratitude. "Let's just get you to your aunt's place and make sure you are settled. Then we will call it even." They made their way down into Petaluma as full darkness fell, and Quinn seemed to know where he was going despite never having been there before. He stopped a man on the street and asked for directions to Hanson's general store, and they were pointed toward the north end of the main street. The store was closed for the night, but there was a house attached to the back, and warm light glowed in the windows. Quinn helped Theresa dismount, and she stood for a moment on shaking legs, staring at the door that might hold her last hope for a future. Fear paralyzed her suddenly. What if her aunt did not remember her? What if she refused to help? What if she turned Theresa away? "I can come with you," Quinn offered, reading her hesitation accurately, "or I can wait out here. Your choice." Theresa wanted him to come with her, wanted his solid presence beside her as she faced this uncertainty, but she knew she had to do this herself. "Wait here," she said. "Please. I will not be long, one way or another." She walked to the door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else and knocked 3 times, the sound echoing in the quiet street. There was movement inside, the sound of footsteps, and then the door swung open to reveal a woman in her mid-40s with graying brown hair and kind eyes that widened in shock as she looked at Theresa. "My God," the woman breathed. "Theresa, is that really you, Aunt Margaret?" Theresa's voice broke on the words, and then suddenly she was being pulled into a fierce embrace, her aunt's arms strong around her. "I heard about your father," Margaret said, her own voice thick with tears. "The news reached us last week. I have been beside myself with worry, not knowing what happened to you. Oh, thank God you are safe. Thank God you are here." Theresa collapsed into her aunt's arms and wept, all the fear and grief and exhaustion pouring out of her in great, shuddering sobs. Margaret held her tightly, murmuring soothing words, and it was only after several minutes that Theresa remembered Quinn waiting outside. She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "There is someone I need you to meet, someone who saved my life." She led her aunt outside, where Quinn stood beside Brutus, his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable and ready to bolt. Margaret took one look at him, her sharp eyes taking in his worn boots, his dusty clothes, and the way he held himself at a respectful distance, and her expression softened. "You brought my niece home safely," she said, and it was not a question. "Yes, madam," Quinn said. "She had some trouble on the trail, but she is a strong woman, made it here mostly on her own." "That is not what it looks like from where I am standing," Margaret said shrewdly. "Those boots tell a story about a man who walked a long way so someone else could ride. Come inside, both of you. You look like you have not had a decent meal in days." "I do not want to impose," Quinn started, but Margaret cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Nonsense. My husband George will want to meet the man who helped our niece. Besides, it is too late to be looking for lodging, and the hotel in this town is not fit for decent folk. You will stay here tonight, and we will not hear another word about it." Quinn looked at Theresa, who nodded encouragingly, and he finally allowed himself to be ushered inside. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of something delicious cooking, and Theresa felt the last of her tension begin to drain away. She was safe. She had made it. George Hansen turned out to be a jovial man with a round belly and a ready laugh, and he greeted Theresa with genuine warmth, despite the fact that he barely remembered her from her childhood. He shook Quinn's hand with enthusiasm and insisted on hearing the whole story of their journey, which Quinn related in his understated way, downplaying his own role. Margaret served them a meal of stew and fresh bread, and Theresa could not remember food ever tasting so good. She ate until she thought she would burst, and across the table, Quinn did the same, though he maintained his polite, reserved demeanor throughout. After dinner, Margaret showed Theresa to a small bedroom at the back of the house, simply furnished but clean and comfortable, and Theresa nearly wept again at the sight of an actual bed. "Quinn can sleep in the spare room," Margaret said, "and tomorrow we will figure out what comes next. But tonight, you both just rest. You have earned it." Theresa wanted to go find Quinn to thank him properly for everything he had done, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave, and she barely managed to remove her boots before she collapsed onto the bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from the kitchen. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was, and then memory flooded back. She was in Petaluma. She was safe. She was with family. She dressed quickly in the same dusty clothes she had been wearing for days, grimacing at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked like something the cat dragged in, her hair a tangled mess, her face still bearing traces of trail dust despite her efforts to clean up the night before. She did the best she could with the water in the basin, then made her way to the kitchen. Quinn was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, looking more rested than he had the day before but still somewhat uncomfortable, as if he was not quite sure what he was doing there. He stood when she entered, and she waved him back down, sliding into the chair across from him. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," Theresa replied, and found herself suddenly shy, unsure what to say to this man who had risked so much for her. "Did you sleep well? Best bed I have had in months," Quinn admitted. "Your aunt and uncle are good people." Margaret bustled in from the store portion of the building, her arms full of folded clothes. "I took the liberty of finding you both some fresh things to wear," she said, setting the pile on the table. "Theresa, these were mine when I was younger. They should fit you well enough. And Quinn, these belonged to our son before he moved to San Francisco. He is about your size." "I cannot take your son's clothes," Quinn protested, but Margaret fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. "He has plenty more where he is, and you need them. Now both of you clean up and put these on. George is making breakfast, and then we need to have a talk about what happens next." The talk, as it turned out, involved Margaret and George insisting that Theresa stay with them for as long as she needed. "You are family," Margaret said firmly. "And this is your home now if you want it to be. George and I never had daughters, only our 2 boys, and they are both grown and gone. It would be a blessing to have you here." Theresa felt tears prick her eyes again, and she grasped her aunt's hands tightly. "Thank you. I do not know what I did to deserve such kindness, but I will find a way to make myself useful. I can help in the store or clean or cook, whatever you need." "We will figure all that out," George said with a smile. "Right now, you just focus on healing. You have been through something terrible, and that takes time." Quinn had been sitting quietly through this exchange, and now he pushed back from the table. "I should be going. Let you all get settled without a stranger underfoot. Where will you go?" Theresa asked, alarmed at the thought of him leaving. She knew it was irrational, knew she had no claim on this man, but the idea of him simply walking out of her life felt wrong somehow. "Find work like I planned," Quinn said with a shrug. "There are ranches around here that might be hiring." "I will be fine." "Actually," George said slowly, "I might have a proposition for you. I have been thinking about expanding the store, maybe adding a stable and tack shop. Been needing someone who knows horses and leather work to help get it started. Would not be glamorous work, and the pay would not be much to start, but it would come with a room above the stable and meals. If you are interested." Quinn stared at George as if the older man had just offered him the moon. "You do not even know me," he said carefully. "Why would you make an offer like that?" "I know you walked 18 miles in the August heat so my niece could ride," George said simply. "I know you brought her to our door when you could have left her to her fate. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. The question is, are you interested?" Quinn looked at Theresa, and their eyes met across the table. She saw the question in his gaze, saw him asking silently if she wanted him to stay, and she realized with startling clarity that she did. She wanted him to stay very much. She nodded just slightly and watched as something in his expression eased. "I am interested," Quinn said, turning back to George. "More than interested. Thank you, sir. You will not regret it." "I do not think I will," George said with satisfaction. "Now let's talk details." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. Theresa threw herself into helping Margaret run the store, learning the inventory and the customers, finding comfort in the routine and structure after so much chaos. The people of Petaluma were curious about the newcomer but generally kind, and she gradually began to feel less like a frightened fugitive and more like a person building a new life. Quinn worked with George to clear the space behind the store and begin construction on the stable. Theresa watched him sometimes from the store window, admiring the easy way he moved, the skill with which he handled tools and materials. He was a man who knew how to work with his hands, who took pride in doing things right, and she found herself increasingly drawn to him. They fell into a pattern of having dinner together most evenings, the four of them around Margaret and George's table, and these meals became the highlight of Theresa's day. Quinn was not a big talker, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and often laced with a dry humor that made her laugh. She learned that he loved horses more than people, that he could fix almost anything with enough time and the right tools, and that he had a habit of whistling when he thought no one was listening. She also learned, slowly and through observation rather than conversation, that he was watching her with the same quiet intensity that she watched him. Their eyes would meet across the table or in passing during the day, and the air between them would charge with something electric and unnamed. Neither of them acted on it, both perhaps too cautious or too uncertain, but the awareness grew with each passing day. One evening in early September, about a month after they had arrived in Petaluma, Theresa was closing up the store when Quinn appeared in the doorway. He had clearly just finished work for the day, his shirt damp with sweat and his hair curling wildly, and she felt her pulse quicken at the sight of him. "Need any help?" he asked. "I am almost done," Theresa said, "but you can walk me back to the house if you want." They fell into step together in the gathering twilight, and for a while they walked in comfortable silence. Then Quinn cleared his throat, a sign that he had something on his mind. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about what happened on the trail, about how we met." "I think about it often," Theresa admitted. "I would be dead if not for you. I know I have said thank you, but it does not feel like enough." "That is not what I mean," Quinn said, stopping and turning to face her. "I mean I think about how it felt meeting you." like something clicked into place that I had not even realized was missing. Does that sound crazy? Theresa's heart was hammering now, and she felt breathless in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. "No," she said softly. "It does not sound crazy at all. I felt it too." Quinn reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, her eyes drifting closed. "I have been trying to figure out how to tell you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "that I am falling in love with you, that I think I started falling the moment I saw you kneeling beside that horse, so heartbroken and brave. But I did not want to presume, did not want to make you uncomfortable after everything you have been through." Theresa opened her eyes and looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability in his face, the fear that she would reject him. "You are not presuming," she said, her own voice shaking slightly. "I have been falling in love with you too. I did not know how to say it either, did not know if it was too soon or if I was just feeling grateful. But it is more than gratitude. It is so much more." Quinn smiled then, a real, genuine smile that transformed his face, and then he was cupping her face in both hands and leaning down to kiss her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking the spell. But then Theresa wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I do not have much to offer you," he said quietly. "I am just a ranch hand turned carpenter with more calluses than savings. But I will work hard, and I will take care of you, and I will love you with everything I have if you will let me." "That is all I want," Theresa said, her hands fisted in his shirt to keep him close. "Just you. Just this." They stood there in the twilight, holding each other, and Theresa felt the last piece of her broken heart slot back into place. She had lost so much, had suffered more than she thought she could bear, but somehow she had found something precious in the ashes of her old life. She had found love, real and true and solid, with a man who had given her his horse and walked beside her into a new future. Margaret and George were delighted when Quinn and Theresa told them about their feelings, though Margaret admitted with a knowing smile that she had seen it coming from the first night. George clapped Quinn on the shoulder and told him he was getting a fine woman, and that he better treat her right or answer to him, which he said with such jovial menace that they all laughed. The next few months passed in a haze of happiness that Theresa had never thought she would experience. She and Quinn courted properly, taking walks in the evening, having meals together, gradually learning all the small details about each other that made up a life. She learned that he liked his coffee strong and his eggs scrambled, that he had a scar on his shoulder from being kicked by a mule when he was 16, that he got quiet when he was thinking deeply about something. He learned that she sang when she was happy, that she had a fierce temper when provoked, that she loved watching the sunset and could name most of the stars. They also talked about the serious things, the painful things. Theresa told him more about her father's death, about the nightmares that still woke her sometimes, about the fear that the men who killed him might somehow find her. Quinn held her through the telling and promised that he would never let anyone hurt her again. He told her more about his brother, about the guilt he still carried for surviving when his brother had not, about the years he had spent drifting because he did not feel like he deserved to put down roots. "You deserve happiness," Theresa told him fiercely. "You deserve a home and a family and all the good things life can offer. Your brother would want that for you." "I know," Quinn said. "I am starting to believe it thanks to you." By December, when the winter rains came to California and turned the streets of Petaluma to mud, Quinn and Theresa knew with certainty that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. Quinn asked George for permission to marry Theresa, a formality since she was a grown woman who could make her own choices, but one that mattered to both of them. George gave his blessing enthusiastically, and that evening, Quinn took Theresa for a walk to a small rise overlooking the town. "I do not have a fancy ring," he said, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "But I have been saving since I started working for George, and I bought this from the jeweler in town last week. Theresa Porter, you are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You make me want to be a better man. Will you marry me?" Theresa was crying before he even finished the question, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her under the stars, and Theresa thought that this moment, right here, was what happiness felt like. They were married in February 1879, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Petaluma. Margaret and George stood up with them, and several townspeople who had become friends attended. Theresa wore a dress that Margaret had made, pale blue with delicate lace, and Quinn wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed for once. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed her with such tenderness that Theresa felt her heart might burst from the sheer joy of it. George gave them the rooms above the stable as a wedding gift, and they spent their first night as husband and wife in the small but comfortable space that would be their first real home. Quinn carried her over the threshold, making her laugh, and then set her down gently in the middle of the main room. "I love you," he said, his hands framing her face. "I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you know that." "I love you too," Theresa said. And then there were no more words, just the two of them learning each other in the way that married couples do, finding joy and comfort and passion in each other's arms. The first year of their marriage was one of steady building and deepening love. Quinn's work on the stable and tack shop progressed well, and by spring, they were open for business. Quinn's reputation as a horseman spread quickly, and soon people were coming from ranches all around Petaluma to have him train their horses or make custom tack. Theresa continued to help Margaret in the store, and together the four of them built a thriving business. More importantly, they built a family. Not just the four of them, but a broader network of friends and neighbors who became like extended family. Petaluma was growing, drawing new people who wanted to make their fortunes in California, and Theresa and Quinn found themselves at the heart of a community that valued hard work, honesty, and loyalty. In the fall of 1879, Theresa discovered she was pregnant. She told Quinn one evening as they sat together on the small porch outside their rooms, watching the sun set over the town. For a moment, he simply stared at her, as if he had not quite processed the words, and then a grin split his face, so wide and joyful that it made her laugh. "We are going to have a baby," he said, and his voice was full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby," Theresa confirmed, and then she was in his arms and he was holding her carefully as if she might break. "I am going to be a father," he said against her hair, and she could hear the emotion thick in his voice. "I am going to be a father, and I swear I will be a good one. I will give our child everything I did not have. I will give them safety and love and a home." "I know you will," Theresa said, her own eyes wet with tears. "You already are." Margaret and George were overjoyed at the news, and Margaret immediately began knitting blankets and tiny clothes, her face glowing with the prospect of becoming a great aunt. The pregnancy was not easy, especially in the first few months, but Quinn was attentive and patient, helping Theresa through the morning sickness and exhaustion. As her belly grew, he would talk to the baby, telling it stories about the horses he trained and the life they would have together. Their son was born on a warm day in June 1880, after a long and difficult labor that left Theresa exhausted but triumphant. Quinn was there through all of it, holding her hand and supporting her, and when the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Quinn wept openly. "He is beautiful," Quinn said, his voice breaking. "He is so beautiful." They named him Thomas after Theresa's father and Porter as his middle name to honor her maiden name. Thomas Morrison came into the world with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's determined chin. And from the moment Quinn held him, Theresa knew that their son would grow up surrounded by love. The years that followed were full of the kind of everyday joys and challenges that make up a life. Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler, into a curious little boy who followed his father around the stable and asked endless questions about everything. Quinn was a patient, devoted father, teaching Thomas about horses and tools and the value of hard work. Theresa watched them together and fell even more in love with her husband, seeing the gentleness and care with which he treated their son. In 1882, their daughter arrived, a tiny, fierce little thing who they named Sarah after Quinn's mother. Where Thomas was calm and thoughtful like his father, Sarah was all fire and energy, keeping them on their toes from the moment she could crawl. Quinn doted on her shamelessly, and Theresa often found him singing to her or telling her elaborate stories before bed. Life was not without its hardships. There were lean years when business was slow, and they had to stretch every dollar. There were illnesses that scared them, particularly when Thomas came down with a terrible fever at age 3 that had them all fearing the worst. But they faced everything together, Quinn and Theresa, partners in every sense of the word, and their love only grew stronger through the trials. Margaret and George grew older but remained active in the business, and the 4 adults worked together to build something stable and lasting. The store expanded, the stable flourished, and Petaluma grew around them, transforming from a rough frontier town into a thriving community. On quiet evenings after the children were in bed, Quinn and Theresa would sit together on their porch, his arm around her shoulders, and talk about their life, about how far they had come from that dusty trail where they had met, about how grateful they were for the twist of fate that had brought them together. "You ever think about what would have happened if I had not come along that day?" Quinn asked her once. "I try not to," Theresa admitted, "because thinking about a life without you in it is too painful. But I will say this. I believe we were meant to find each other. I believe everything that happened, as terrible as it was, led me to you, and I would not trade what we have for anything in the world." Quinn pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Theresa Morrison. More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," she said, and settled more comfortably against his side, content in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the years continued to pass, they faced new challenges and celebrated new joys. In 1885, when Thomas was 5 and Sarah was 3, they welcomed another daughter, whom they named Elizabeth. She was a calm, sweet-natured baby who seemed to bring peace wherever she went, and she completed their family in a way that felt perfect. The children grew up surrounded by the bustle of the store and stable, learning early the value of hard work and community. Thomas showed a natural affinity for horses like his father, and by the time he was 8, he was helping Quinn train the gentler animals. Sarah was drawn to the store, charming customers with her bright smile and quick wit, while Elizabeth seemed content wherever she was, as long as her family was near. Quinn and Theresa aged together, their love maturing and deepening with each passing year. The passion of their early days remained, but it was tempered now with the comfort of true partnership, of knowing each other so completely that they could communicate with a glance or a touch. They had built a life together from nothing, and it was more than either of them had ever dreamed possible. In 1890, on a warm summer evening much like the one when they had first declared their love, Quinn took Theresa back to the rise overlooking Petaluma where he had proposed. The children were with Margaret and George, giving them a rare evening alone, and they walked hand in hand up the familiar path. "I wanted to come back here," Quinn said, "because this is where I asked you to marry me. And I wanted to tell you that if I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a single thing. Every moment with you has been a gift. Every day with you has been more than I ever thought I deserved." Theresa's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears, the kind that came from a heart too full of joy to contain it all. "You deserve everything good in this world," she said fiercely. "You gave me your horse and walked beside me when you could have ridden past and left me to my fate. You saved my life, Quinn Morrison, in more ways than you will ever know." "You saved mine too," Quinn said softly. "I was just drifting before I met you, going through the motions of living without really being alive. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something lasting. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. Everything I am, everything I have, is because of you." They kissed then. As the sun set over the town they had made their own, and Theresa thought about the scared, grieving girl she had been when she rode into Quinn's life on a dying horse. That girl felt like a different person now, someone from another lifetime. She had been forged in the fire of loss and hardship, but she had come through it stronger, with a man by her side who had proven time and time again that true love was not just something from stories, but something real and achievable. As they walked back down to town to their children and their home and their life, Quinn squeezed her hand. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" Theresa asked. "For saying yes that day on the trail when I offered you my horse, for trusting me enough to let me help you, for giving me the chance to love you. Thank you for being the kind of man who would give a stranger his horse and walk 18 miles in the heat," Theresa replied. "Thank you for seeing me when I was at my lowest and loving me anyway. Thank you for building this beautiful life with me." They reached their home, and their children came running out to meet them, Thomas lifting Sarah up so she could see over the fence, Elizabeth toddling behind them with her arms outstretched. Quinn scooped up Elizabeth while Theresa hugged Thomas and Sarah, and they all went inside together, a family complete and whole. The years continued their steady march, bringing with them the joys and sorrows that make up a human life. They lost George to heart failure in 1893, and all of them mourned the loss of the man who had given Quinn his chance and had welcomed Theresa into his family without hesitation. Margaret continued to run the store with Theresa's help, and though she grieved deeply, she found comfort in her great niece and great nephews who filled her days with laughter. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with the same quiet competence and gentle way with horses. By the time he was 16, he was running the stable alongside Quinn, and they made a formidable team. Sarah had inherited her mother's sharp mind and quick tongue, and she talked often of wanting to expand the store, to bring in new goods from San Francisco and Sacramento. Elizabeth, sweet Elizabeth, loved books and learning, and Theresa and Quinn supported her desire to become a teacher, proud that their daughter wanted to educate others. In 1896, when Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 68, Theresa grieved but also felt grateful. Her aunt had given her a home when she had nothing, had welcomed her with open arms, and had been a constant source of love and support. The store passed to Theresa, and she ran it with Sarah's help, expanding it just as her daughter had dreamed, turning it into one of the most successful businesses in Petaluma. Quinn continued to work with horses, though he slowed down as the years took their toll on his body. The hard walk from Sacramento to Petaluma all those years ago had left him with occasional pain in his legs and feet, especially in the cold and damp, but he never complained. When Theresa massaged liniment into his sore muscles at night, he would joke that it was worth every ache to have found her. Their children grew and eventually started families of their own. Thomas married a rancher's daughter named Rebecca, and they had 3 children who were the light of Quinn and Theresa's lives. Sarah married a merchant from San Francisco, and though it broke Theresa's heart a little to see her daughter move away, she was glad Sarah had found someone who appreciated her sharp mind and fierce independence. Elizabeth became a teacher as she had always wanted, and though she remained unmarried, she was happy and fulfilled, shaping young minds in the Petaluma schoolhouse. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1899, Quinn and Theresa renewed their vows in the same church where they had married, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and friends. Quinn was 46 now, his dark hair streaked with silver, lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. Theresa was 43, her own hair showing threads of gray, her hands rough from years of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they saw not the marks of age but the evidence of a life well lived, of love that had endured and grown stronger with time. 20 years ago, I promised to love you for the rest of my life, Quinn said, his voice steady and sure. That promise was the easiest I have ever made, and keeping it has been the greatest joy of my life. I love you more today than I did then, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for being my wife, my partner, my best friend. Theresa was crying, but they were tears of happiness. You walked beside me when I had nothing, she said. You gave me your horse, your home, your heart. You have been my rock, my comfort, my greatest blessing. I love you, Quinn Morrison, with everything I am and everything I have. Today and always. They kissed, and their family cheered, and the celebration that followed was full of laughter and music, and the kind of joy that comes from people who have built something beautiful together. As the new century dawned in 1900, Quinn and Theresa looked back on their lives with satisfaction and forward to the future with hope. They had survived so much, had overcome obstacles that could have broken them, and they had done it together. Their love story had begun with a dying horse on a dusty trail, with a man generous enough to give up his mount for a stranger, and it had grown into something that touched not just their own lives but the lives of everyone around them. They continued to work together, running the business that had grown from George's small store and stable into a thriving enterprise. They continued to love each other with the same intensity that had brought them together, though now it was tempered with the comfort of deep familiarity. They grew older, their bodies slowing down but their spirits remaining strong. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch they had built onto their home above the stable, watching the sun set over Petaluma and talking about their day, their children, their grandchildren, their life. Sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, his hand holding hers, content in each other's presence. You remember that day on the trail? Theresa asked him one evening in 1905, when they had been married for 26 years. When you first saw me with my horse, I remember thinking you looked like you were about to fall apart, but were holding yourself together through sheer will, Quinn said with a small smile. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen. And I remember deciding right then that I was going to help you no matter what. Best decision you ever made? Theresa asked, a teasing note in her voice. Best decision I ever made, Quinn confirmed, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles gently. That walk to Petaluma was worth everything that came after. Every single thing. As the years advanced into the 1910s, Quinn's health began to fail. The years of hard physical labor had taken their toll, and a persistent cough that started in the winter of 1912 never quite went away. Theresa nursed him through it, just as he had supported her through so many trials, but she could see him weakening and it terrified her. The thought of a life without Quinn was unbearable, and she prayed nightly that he would recover. He made it through that winter and the next, but in the fall of 1914, he took a turn for the worse. The doctors could do little, and Quinn knew his time was coming. He faced it with the same quiet courage he had faced everything else in his life, but it broke his heart to think of leaving Theresa. "I am not ready to go," he told her one night as she sat beside his bed, holding his hand. "I want more time with you. I want to see our great-grandchildren grow up. I want to sit on that porch with you for another 20 years. "I want that too," Theresa said, tears streaming down her face. "I want it so much. But if you have to go, I need you to know that you made my life beautiful. You saved me in every way a person can be saved, and I have loved you with everything in me. You are the best man I have ever known, and I will carry you in my heart until the day I die." Quinn reached up with his free hand and wiped away her tears. "I will wait for you," he said. "Wherever I end up, I will wait for you, and when you get there, I will be standing there with Brutus, ready to walk beside you again." He died peacefully 3 days later, with Theresa holding his hand and their children gathered around. He was 61 years old, and he had lived a full, rich life. But for Theresa, it felt like the sun had gone out of the sky. The grief was overwhelming at first, a physical pain that left her gasping. She had lost her father young, had faced death and danger and hardship, but nothing had prepared her for the loss of Quinn. He had been her partner for 35 years, her anchor, her home. The world felt empty without him in it, but she was not alone. Her children rallied around her, and her grandchildren brought her joy even in the midst of sorrow. She continued to run the business, finding comfort in routine and work, and slowly, painfully, she began to heal. Not that the grief went away, it never truly did, but she learned to carry it, to find moments of happiness amid the sadness. She lived on for another 16 years, watching her grandchildren have children of their own, seeing the business she and Quinn had built continue to thrive. She told stories about Quinn to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who had never known him. She talked about how they met, about his generosity and kindness, about the love that had sustained them through everything. In the spring of 1930, at the age of 73, Theresa fell ill with pneumonia. She knew, as her children gathered around her bed much as they had gathered around Quinn's, that her time had come, and she found that she was not afraid. She was tired, and she missed Quinn with an ache that had never diminished, and she was ready to see him again. "I am going to be with your father," she told her children, her voice weak but certain. "He has been waiting for me long enough." Thomas, now 50 and with silver in his own hair, held her hand tightly. "Tell him we said thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being the father we needed and for loving our mother the way he did." "He knows," Theresa said with a faint smile. "He always knew." She closed her eyes that evening as the sun set, the same sun she and Quinn had watched together so many times, and she let go. And in that moment, she could swear she heard his voice, warm and familiar, calling her home. She could almost feel his hand in hers, steady and sure, ready to walk beside her once more into whatever came next. Her children buried her beside Quinn in the Petaluma cemetery, under a large oak tree that provided shade in the summer and shelter in the winter. The headstone reads simply, Theresa Porter Morrison, 1856–1930, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She rode through hardship with courage and love. And beside it, Quinn's stone. Quinn Morrison, 1853–1914, beloved husband, father, and grandfather. He walked beside her every step of the way. The business they had built continued for generations, run by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The story of how Quinn and Theresa met became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, a reminder that love can be found even in the darkest times, that generosity and kindness matter, and that the choice to help a stranger can change the entire course of a life. The stable where Quinn had worked was eventually torn down to make way for more modern buildings, but the store remained, a fixture in Petaluma for decades. And every so often, someone would look at the old photographs hung on the wall, showing a serious man with gray-green eyes and a woman with a determined chin, standing together in front of their business, and they would ask about the couple in the picture. And whoever was asked would smile and say, "That is Quinn and Theresa Morrison. They are the reason we are all here. Let me tell you about the day they met." And they would tell the story of a woman on a dying horse, and a man generous enough to give up his mount and walk 18 miles through the California heat. They would tell about the love that grew from that single act of kindness, about the family that sprang from two people who had lost everything and found each other. They would tell about partnership and perseverance, about building a life together through good times and bad. And they would tell it as a love story, because that was what it was. Not a fairy tale with a prince and princess, but a real, true story about two real, true people who had loved each other fiercely and well, who had faced hardship and heartbreak and had come through it together, stronger for having walked side by side through it all. It was a story about how a single moment of compassion could ripple out across years and generations, creating waves of love and family and community. It was a story about how the smallest choices could have the biggest consequences, how deciding to help rather than pass by could change everything. But most of all, it was a story about love. The kind of love that endures beyond death, that lives on in children and grandchildren, and the memories of those who remain. The kind of love that starts with a dying horse and a generous heart and grows into something that touches everyone it reaches. And in Petaluma, California, that story never died. It lived on, as all true love stories do, in the hearts of those who heard it and recognized in it something universal and eternal. The understanding that we are all, in the end, just travelers on a long, dusty trail, and that the greatest gift we can give each other is to walk beside each other, to offer our strength when someone else's fails, and to love with everything we have for as long as we are given. Quinn and Theresa Morrison had done that. They had loved well, and they had loved truly, and their love had created something beautiful that lasted long after they were gone. And whenever anyone asked what real love looked like, the people of Petaluma would point to their story and say, "It looks like a man giving a stranger his horse and walking beside her to safety. It looks like building a life together one day at a time. It looks like Quinn and Theresa." And that was the best legacy anyone could leave behind. Not wealth or fame, but love. Simple, generous, enduring love that changed the world, one heart at a time. The end.